All right, everybody, let's start Unit 4, which is all about Georgia becoming a state. The first part we're going to focus on is what happened at the end of the French and Indian War. So that's what you're going to be hearing about in this section. Here's the main question. What British government policies and taxes led to Georgia's involvement in the American War for Independence? So there's a direct connection between British government policies and taxes and the American Revolution. And we're going to talk about what those are. So, here are the big ideas. The English established a new policy following the French and Indian War. Now, just to remind you, the French and Indian War is a war between England and France. The colonists are on the side of the English, which makes sense, and the Indians are on the side of the French. So it's in some ways the colonists against the Indians. After that, the British decide to use the existing laws that they have to govern larger territories, to pay off debts, that's important, and laws that they had to control the Indians were to be better enforced. Well, the colonists resisted the new enforcement of these laws that were on the books, and so as the colonists resisted, Britain passed more laws to try to make them go along with things, which just met with increased resistance. So it was a sort of a downward spiral. Here is a timeline. You're going to eventually need to, on a test, put some of these things in chronological order. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts, and the Declaration of Independence. It's important that you know not necessarily the years that those happened, but the order in which they happened, because one thing led to another. Okay, so what happened after the French and Indian War? Great Britain wanted the American colonists to help pay off debts created by the French and Indian War. As far as Great Britain was concerned, the reason for fighting the war was to help the colonists. Therefore, the colonists should help pay for the cost of the war. As far as England was concerned, that was a very reasonable expectation. Now, there were also trade laws, or the Navigation Acts, that were on the books. This goes back to that idea of mercantilism. The Navigation Acts required that certain goods be sold only to Great Britain or its colonies, like rice, indigo, and fur from Georgia. So British merchants controlled manufactured goods and trade with the colonies. The colonists began to resent this and began to smuggle or secretly import and export products to France and to other places. Now, Georgia was a little bit different from the other colonies. They sort of liked the protection from Indians by the British soldiers, although they didn't like providing housing and supplies for soldiers. We'll talk about that in class. Georgia no longer felt threatened by the English or the French on its borders, so in that sense, it helped them want to become more independent, but they did not like the restrictions on trade. Now, something that was going on at this time was the Proclamation of 1763. This was part of the treaty that ended the French and Indian War in 1763. What it did was create a line along the crest of the Appalachians. It was designed to keep peace with the Native Americans. Now, no British or colonial settlers were to settle west of that line. And anybody who had already moved west of that line had to leave. Northern colonists didn't like it because they thought it only protected the Indians and limited their access to the Ohio River Territory. We're going to look at a map in just a minute. That wasn't the case in Georgia. In Georgia, the Treaty of Augusta opened Georgia land between the Ogeechee and the Savannah rivers, which was not west of the proclamation line. So Georgia indirectly benefited from the proclamation. Settlers from Virginia and the Carolinas who could no longer settle west of the land moved south to Georgia. Let's take a look at the map. So here is the proclamation line. The reason the northern colonies really didn't like it is because as a result of the French and Indian War, the British now controlled all of this land. However, they made a deal that colonists could not move west of it. Now, as far as the northern colonists were concerned, part of the reason for fighting the French and Indian War, because the Indians were on the side of the French, was to be able to move into and expand westward. Well, when the British made this part of the treaty, it did not go over well. This is what you need to do for homework for this part 1 of Unit 4. All right, let's keep moving forward in time. The Sugar and Stamp Acts. The Sugar Act enforced taxes on molasses. Sugar is made from molasses. So it enforced taxes on molasses imports from the West Indies, which hurt merchants and smugglers. The Stamp Act of 1765 forced colonists to buy stamps on all printed material and documents, like legal documents, in order to do anything like sign contracts, wills. They were going to have to buy a stamp. So if you didn't buy the stamps, you were sort of paralyzed as far as any legal matters were concerned. This is the point at which Georgia and the other colonies resent the idea that there's a tax on them while they don't have any representatives in Parliament. This causes protest against the term that you've heard, taxation without representation. There were no colonists in the English Parliament. There began to be organized protest. Georgia didn't send anybody to the Stamp Act Congress. That was more New England colonies. But there were people in Georgia who agreed with the protests. The Sons of Liberty formed in Savannah, and there were protests in Savannah against the Stamp Act. But by 1766, Georgia was the only colony that actually sold any of the stamps. And lots of the younger colonists, the people who were part of the Sons of Liberty, really resented the fact that Georgia did sell the stamps. Because of all the protest, Parliament canceled the Stamp Act in 1766, but not before lots of protests had gone on. So what do you think the colonists learned from the fact that when they protested the Stamp Act, Parliament canceled it? There were more taxes. The Townshend Act of 1767 put a tax on things coming into the colonies like glass, paint, and tea. Georgians did meet to pass resolutions against the Townshend Acts. In South Carolina, they began to boycott British-made goods. Then Great Britain repealed the Townshend Act, except for the tax on tea. So many colonists started to only drink untaxed tea that had been smuggled in. By 1770, things had gotten so tense, especially in the city of Boston, where there was a major presence of British soldiers, that we end up with an altercation called the Boston Massacre. We're going to talk about this very famous engraving in class. So, The questions are, do you think this is historically accurate? Does it illustrate what actually happened? Why or why not? And I want you to be prepared to discuss this in class.